In the interwar period of the 20th century, Europe found itself in quite a potent state of disarray. The Great War had shattered the old order, and in the aftermath, a new kind of leader emerged simultaneously in all corners of the continent, one that promised stability amidst the chaos of revolution, economic collapse, and ideological strife. Lenin in Russia, Mussolini in Italy, Dollfuss in Austria, all of these are just examples of the new authoritarian personality which captivated the European continent. In the Iberian Peninsula, two men would rise to prominence following this political trend: Franco of Spain and Antonio de Oliveira Salazar of Portugal. Franco's Spanish Civil War, which raged from 1936 to 1939, was not merely a clash of armies, but a crucible of ideologies. On one side stood the Republicans, a fractious coalition of communists, socialists, anarchists, and liberals. Opposing them were the nationalists, a motley assembly of monarchists, conservatives, and fascists, united by their desire to crush the left. General Franco was the nationalist leader, a man whose rise was as much about cunning as it was about conviction. Franco was not the most senior nor the most charismatic of the nationalist leaders, but he was shrewd, patient, and ruthless, not unlike his contemporaries who took power in Russia. From the Canary Islands, he declared his military revolution, and upon his arrival to the Spanish mainland, he eliminated his rivals and emerged as the undisputed leader of the nationalist cause. With military support from Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, Franco's forces finally seized Madrid in 1939, marking the end of the Republic and the beginning of Franco's nearly 4-decade-long dictatorship. Under Franco, Spain became a nationalist authoritarian state. The regime was deeply conservative, fiercely Catholic, and violently repressive, imprisoning or executing tens of thousands of opponents in the war's aftermath. Under Franco's own unique ideology, Phalangism, his country strayed away from the revolutionary and reactionary tendencies of fascism in Italy and Germany, and instead focused on the organization of the state, developing a nation that was strictly hierarchical and anti-liberal. Phalangism was simultaneously anti-communist, anti-capitalist, and anti-democratic, and with the Phalangist Manifesto, known as the 27 Points, Spain worked to eliminate regionalism, forge a unified Catholic Spanish identity, and develop a national syndicalist economy, a mixture of Italian corporatism and classical socialism. But of course, Franco wasn't the only man on the Iberian Peninsula who would dictate the path of an entire nation. To the west of Spain, Portugal's own political turmoil had birthed a quieter dictatorship under Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. In the early 1920s, Portugal was reeling from a decade of instability marked by coups, economic crises, and social unrest, much of which can actually be traced all the way back to the Portuguese split with Brazil. The Republic, established in 1910 after the fall of the monarchy, was a fragile experiment, and political gridlock only worsened public confidence in republicanism. Salazar, himself an intellectual and economist, first entered the government in 1928 as Minister of Finance, tasked with restoring the country's battered budget. He swiftly gained a reputation for quite literally pulling Portugal back from the brink of bankruptcy with strict budgeting policies. By 1932, Salazar had maneuvered himself into the role of Prime Minister, and from there he built the Estado Novo, or the New State, a corporatist nationalist government that promised stability, order, and national rebirth. Unlike the more flamboyant fascist regimes of Italy and Germany, Salazar's nationalist rule was far more paternalistic and conservative. He omitted mass rallies and the overt militarism of his fascist contemporaries from his political checklist, instead imposing a highly organized national government that simultaneously kept a tight grip on every aspect of Portuguese life and remained relatively absent from the stage of international scandal. Political opposition was quietly crushed, censorship campaigns were carefully carried out, and Salazar's secret police ensured compliance. Yet Portugal remained outwardly tranquil, projecting an image of orderly calm in the face of the storm. As Franco and Salazar brushed their coats and polished their newly forged Iberian states, another strongman to the east, Benito Mussolini, looked to form a partnership with them and control the Mediterranean. Mussolini, of course, envisioned a grand alliance of Mediterranean fascist and nationalist states, a league of like-minded regimes that would include Italy, Spain, Portugal, and perhaps Croatia, Greece, and France, should the political situation in these regions favor them. This Mediterranean League would stand as a bulwark against communism and a counterbalance to the Anglo-French hegemony in Europe. Mussolini, of course, envisioned a rebirth of the Roman Empire, and this was just one step towards that, and he also saw Franco's and Salazar's governments as natural allies in this vision. While there were never any formal military alliances, largely due to Spain's desire to avoid deeper entanglement after their civil war, Franco and Salazar maintained close diplomatic and economic ties with Mussolini's Italy. Beyond the visions of external alliances, there were also periodic calls for a closer union between Spain and Portugal. Over the decades, several proposals for some form of Iberian union were floated, seeking to merge or closely align the two countries into a single bloc. These ideas ranged from loose federations to more ambitious plans for outright unification under a single ruler. Franco himself, on several occasions, entertained the notion of an Iberian Union, seeing it as a way to further consolidate his power and quell the regionalism that plagued Spain and, to a greater degree, Iberia in general. However, these proposals were consistently hampered by a serious mutual distrust, and also the nationalist pride and differing visions for what such a union would entail. Salazar was deeply wary of Franco's ambitions and quite fiercely protective of Portuguese sovereignty and independence. By the early 1970s, as the Franco and Salazar regimes both began to show signs of wear, the prospect of an Iberian Union had, for the second time in history, faltered. Franco, now an old man beset by illness, was losing his grip on Spain, and Salazar had suffered debilitating stroke in 1968, leading to his replacement by Marcelo Caetano, a proponent of the Estado Novo, but a much more moderate one at that. The Carnation Revolution, a bloodless military coup led by disillusioned officers tired of the costly colonial wars in Africa, toppled Caetano's regime almost overnight. And in Spain, the end came, less dramatically, but no less significantly. When Franco died in 1975, King Juan Carlos I, Franco's chosen successor, simply moved to dismantle the Francoist state, ushering in a transition to a constitutional monarchy. Thus, no greater consolidation of the authoritarian states of Iberia came to be, and the focus of the people of Spain and Portugal swiftly turned to the Cold War and the hotly brewing proxy wars between the NATO alliance and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, leaving Franco and Salazar behind as simple periods in their national histories. But what if that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Fransisco Franco's vision for an authoritarian Iberian Union came to fruition? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help contribute to these scenarios or just have ideas you'd like to have made into videos, consider becoming a channel member or supporting us on Patreon. A special thanks to Zax from the US of Z Discord server for submitting this scenario. Now back to the video. The year is 1965. For the two autocrats of Iberia, the world of the 60s was not one of progress, but of looming threats. The forces of nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism that had once brought them to power were waning, being replaced across Europe by liberalism in the West and socialism in the East. Spain, under Franco's iron fist, was slowly emerging from the economic stagnation of the post-war years, thanks in part to a series of economic reforms led by technocratic ministers within his government. Known as the Spanish Miracle, this period brought new prosperity to Spain's cities. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The repression of regional identities in Catalonia and the Basque Country, the stifling of political dissent, and the growing discontent among a more liberal youth threatened to destabilize Franco's carefully controlled state. In Portugal, Salazar's Estado Novo was similarly grappling with the pressures of the changing world. Ongoing colonial wars in Africa were draining the country's resources, both financially and morally. Salazar was a protector of Portuguese independence, and he clung stubbornly to his nation's colonial possessions, believing that Portugal's future as a great power lay in its overseas empire. But the costs were certainly mounting. Young men were sent to fight in faraway lands, returning home in coffins or broken by the trauma of war. The economy, though stable, was increasingly out of step with the more dynamic markets of Western Europe. Salazar was not a man given to grandiose gestures. He valued Portuguese sovereignty, and his mistrust of Franco's ambitions was well known. But by 1965, a confluence of factors would lead him to reconsider his stance. Portugal was drained of both men and money, and with international pressure mounting, even Britain and the United States, both crucial allies against communism, were becoming increasingly critical of Portugal's stubborn refusal to decolonize. When Franco arrived in Lisbon that June to make a bold proposal to Salazar, the Portuguese prime minister would find himself begrudgingly more attentive than in decades past. Franco's proposal was one that appealed to both men's sense of pragmatism and ideology. Spain was dealing with similar issues as Portugal, but perhaps, he argued, a united Iberian Peninsula under the banner of a new federation could stand as a bulwark against the forces of decolonization and liberalization, combining the intellectual classes of Salazar's inner circle and the successful Spanish technocrats to better resist international condemnation and forge, for Iberia, a unique path divergent from both the liberal and socialist world orders. For Salazar, the proposal was not an easy sell. He hated the idea from the start, when Franco first came to him in the 20s and later the 40s. But the promise of support in the colonial wars and a greater combined economy was tantalizing to the weary Salazar. He was a realist above all, and he recognized that Portugal alone could not sustain its empire nor withstand the growing tide of international isolation. The Iberian Federation, as Franco called it, was not a surrender of independence, but a necessary evolution, an alliance to preserve an older order in a world that was rapidly slipping away. On July 18, 1965, the Iberian Federation would be officially proclaimed, a union of two nations bound by history, linguistic roots, and now a shared statist vision with a new governmental hierarchy prepared to stand against the West and East. At the top of this hierarchy stood Franco and Salazar, the undisputed leaders of the Federation. Franco assumed the title of Supreme Regent, wielding ultimate authority over the military and foreign policy, while Salazar was named First Minister of the Federation, responsible for economic and colonial affairs. Below them, a joint Iberian Council was established composed of representatives from each region. To solidify this new union psychologically, the Federation embarked on a sweeping campaign of propaganda, aimed at suppressing regional nationalism and cementing the sense of a shared identity among the disparate peoples of the peninsula. The message was clear. The Iberian Federation was not merely a political union, but a rebirth of a grand civilization, a rebirth of the grandeur of the Portuguese and Spanish empires of old, united in their defiance of external threats. Schools, media, and public ceremonies were all leveraged to promote the idea of Iberianism, a new national identity that transcended old regional loyalties. Populism became the engine of the Federation's domestic policy. Franco positioned himself as the protector of the common man, railing against the perceived decadence of Western liberal democracies and the encroaching threat of communism. Public works projects, grand military parades, and carefully staged mass rallies served to project an image of strength and unity. The Federation's corporatist economy, with its emphasis on state control, labor syndicates, and business-government collaboration, was presented as a third way between the failures of capitalism and communism. Behind closed doors, Salazar found himself mentally in shambles. Regret washed over him like the waves of the Atlantic, and as his age began to catch up to him, he feared that his decision would now lead Portugal to fall to the same fate as Germany and Italy only 20 years ago. But the world continued its march towards liberalization, and the Iberian Federation found itself initially isolated. Western European powers distanced themselves diplomatically and economically from the Federation. International condemnation mounted, but Franco only doubled down. This idea of a besieged Iberian homeland under threat from communists, liberals, and the decadent West became a cornerstone of the regime's narrative. It was a strategy devised to galvanize the public. But this would not be the only outlet for Iberia to skirt Western sanctions. The Federation's vision, in the wake of bubbling turmoil in South America and the Eastern Mediterranean, evolved into something more ambitious. A transnational alliance of like-minded states united in their commitment to authoritarian nationalist rule. This new axis of power, centered around the Iberian Federation, would come to be known as the Organización Internacional de Resistencia, or the International Organization of Resistance. One of their first goals would be to forge a partnership with the new Greek government. In 1967, Greece had fallen under the control of the Aprilian junta, led by Georgios Papadopoulos. Following several months of secretive negotiations, this ideologically aligned Greece would join the OIR as an observer state in 1968. Spanish and Portuguese troops would be sent to Greece to help normalize the situation and promote the junta's legitimacy. This Mediterranean focus would be sharpened in 1974, when Iberia and Greece would support a pro-NOC coup in Cyprus, NOC being the political union between Greece and Cyprus, triggering, of course, a violent response from Turkey. However, this time, a massive Iberian military intervention, with diplomatic support from the British, would crush the Turkish invasion, marking a rare and devastating defeat for Turkey. While Cyprus would not yet be in the position to fully unify with Greece, a massive step would have been taken towards this goal, and Cyprus would find itself the newest observer state in the OIR. The real power and the main focus of the OIR would actually come from South America, however. Brazil, under the rule of a military dictatorship that embraced anti-communism and corporatism, was a natural partner. In Argentina, the OIR found another ally in the junta that seized power in 1967, driven by a desire to stamp out leftist insurgencies. And furthermore, in Chile, the OIR would actually work alongside the United States to combat the rise of socialist Salvador Allende. In order to prevent a leftist takeover, the Chilean military, with direction from the CIA and the Iberian government, would suspend the presidential election of 1970, preempting the rise of Allende. The insurgency that followed would see the United States cooperate with Spanish, Greek, and Argentinian forces in collaboration with Pinochet to suppress the leftists, earning Greece and Argentina full membership status in the OIR, and repairing relations with the United States for the time being. But it wouldn't be smooth sailing. In fact, far from it. In 1970, Salazar would have died of stroke. It would later be discovered, as his office was in the process of being transformed into a museum of the Federation, that Salazar had fallen into a deep depression in the years leading up to his stroke, and felt that he would never reconcile the decision he had made in 1965. But the Franco regime was quick to move on. Seeking not to isolate Portugal from the new Iberian identity, Franco would appoint a favorable Portuguese politician to the role of First Minister. His choice would be Joaquim de Silva Cunha, former Minister of Defense of Portugal under Salazar. But then in 1975, Franco too would pass away. Rather than having Juan Carlos I succeed Franco, however, another minister would. You see, a component of the formation of the Iberian Federation was, for the sake of unity, an abandonment of any monarchist pathways to power. Thus, any agreements with Juan Carlos would be thrown out in the wake of the Federation's formation. Instead, it would be Blas Piñar, a 52-year-old Francoist hardliner who, in our history, was dismissed for his criticism of Spain's friendly relations with the United States. But in our alternate timeline, Piñar would embody the exact sentiments Franco sought to engrave in the Iberian Federation's new government. In early December of 1975, Piñar would be held up as the new supreme regent, and a period of stabilization would begin. For Franco and Salazar's successors, the Federation would transform from a European power into the leader of a broader Latin authoritarian renaissance. Diplomatic envoys, military intelligence, and economic treaties were exchanged, binding the Iberian Federation and its Latin American allies into a cohesive bloc. The reach of our OIR soon would extend beyond Latin America, however, finding allies in the embattled white minority regimes of southern Africa. The Rhodesian Bush War, already a brutal struggle against communist-backed insurgents, became the crucible in which the OIR would prove its military might. The Bush Wars in Rhodesia, Angola, and Mozambique, once disparate and isolated conflicts, soon merged into an interconnected theater of counterinsurgency campaigns led by the Organización. The OIR's commitment to these wars was absolute, viewing them as not only regional struggles but as critical battles in the war against communism. This would be the OIR's first opportunity as well to test its military cohesion on the ground, and see if it could live up to the standards set by NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Rhodesian scouts, expert in guerrilla tactics, led the way, conducting deep penetration raids into enemy-held territories. They struck at MPLA and ZANU strongholds, dismantling supply lines and disrupting the flow of arms from the Soviet Union and China. Meanwhile, Brazilian and Chilean paratroopers, hardened by their own counterinsurgency experiences in the mountains and jungles of Latin America, would descend upon the Zambezi River, cutting off key rebel escape routes. In Mozambique, Afrikaner volunteers from South Africa manned garrisons in Maputo, fortifying the city against Frelimo attacks and working alongside Iberian advisors who brought decades of colonial military experience to the fight. South Africa, too, would find itself joining the ranks of the OIR alongside Rhodesia. Iberian and Latin American forces were now spread across every front, providing logistical support, intelligence, and air cover to the South African and Rhodesian militaries. It was a massive, multinational counterinsurgency operation, unparalleled in scale and ferocity perhaps until the War on Terror in the 2000s. The OIR's presence in southern Africa was not just a show of force, it was a statement of intent. This was an alliance determined to crush the spread of communism by any means necessary. Now, the nation of Botswana found itself surrounded by OIR states on all sides. Botswana was highly regarded as one of the most stable African nations at the time, but it was also one of the poorest. In 1970, Botswana had founded the Botswana Development Corporation, which worked with the Soviet Union and their former colonial overlords, the British, to develop their economy. The program was actually highly successful, and with the help of European subsidies and responsible financial management, Botswana managed to develop an emerging beef industry and very profitable mining industries, the most profitable of which tended to be in diamond mining. Botswana's leadership took a much less flamboyant and inflammatory political and social route, spending money modestly and refusing to adopt extreme political views, unlike many of the post-colonial governments surrounding them. By the late 1970s, Botswana was a profitable country, one with the money to support its largely homogeneous population of Tswanans, and it even cooperated with the white British minority farmers who lived alongside Botswana's border with Rhodesia. Effectively, Botswana was a model for a post-colonial government that was productive and protective of its citizens. Unfortunately, however, as a result of Rhodesian, Portuguese, and South African victories against the various Soviet-backed militias in the region, many communist militants would find themselves fleeing into Botswana. Botswana would soon essentially find itself serving as an unintended sanctuary for communist militias, who from within Botswana's borders launched attacks across the region, using the country's neutrality as a shield from reprisal. For the OIR, this was an intolerable situation. A military intervention in Botswana was staged, and a pro-OIR government was installed under the helm of placing the nation effectively under Rhodesian, Afrikaner, and Portuguese military occupation. Botswana would also join the OIR as an observer state until the OIR saw fit to fully integrate the nation into their alliance. Now, this action would certainly see the OIR fall out of good favor with the United States and, most importantly, the British, as, from the Western point of view, the OIR had essentially supported a coup in a relatively stable, Western-backed nation who was setting an example for post-colonial home African rule. Regardless, the long bush wars in southern Africa would continue into the early 1980s as the Soviet Union and China struggled to maintain their proxies in the region. Nonetheless, OIR military successes in Africa would bring the OIR to come to define itself in the 1980s with a new economic lens. Resource extraction would be promoted across its member states, with a particular focus on oil, rubber, and diamonds, fueling an economic boom that funded ambitious infrastructure and military projects. The development of OIR native military technology, such as Brazil's EET-1 Ossuario tank and Rhodesia's pioneering MRAP vehicles, placed the OIR's military capabilities in the realm of those of the United States and the Soviet Union. Of course, not quite to the same level, but still among the great powers of the Cold War. These vehicles would be sold to the Baathists of Iraq, opening a market often closed to the West, but one which the OIR could easily tap into. But these actions would have consequences, and what would come to be known as the Second First World, the OIR, would continue to have to navigate its, at times, rocky relationship with the West in the early 1990s. During the Gulf War of 1991, OIR forces would join the global coalition against Iraq, seizing the opportunity to field test EET-2 tanks against Saddam Hussein's forces. The OIR would find itself working closely with the Baathists in Kuwait, and by extension would come to diplomatically prop up the Assadist regime in Syria, finding not only a market for their arms, but a like-minded government in the region which could encircle Turkey, should conflict arise with the Greeks over Cyprus again. But cooperation with the West in the Gulf War did little to repair relations with the liberal democracies of Europe. As OIR member states in southern Africa developed their economies, they utilized the tools of political repression to maintain stability and white minority rule, which resulted in constant condemnations by the United Nations. But the OIR ignored these calls for what they perceived to be purely Western-aligned international institutions. With the Cold War having come to an end in the 1990s in full spring, the future was uncertain for the Organization of Resistance, watching as the West enjoyed its most prosperous era. Perhaps their ideological differences could be reconciled, or perhaps a new ideological Cold War lay on the horizon. Let me know what you think. Again, special thanks to Zax from the US of Z Discord server for writing this scenario. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you really liked hearing about the Organización Internacional de Resistencia. You can support us on Patreon by following the link in the description, or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.